What started the War of 1812? Adele asked her grandfather. Did we have a big army and navy back then? JP asked, almost at the same time as his sister. Well, replied Grandfather Lafitte, the answers to both of those questions are related. To answer your question first, JP, we did not have a large army or navy back then. We had a fairly small navy and only about 4,000 soldiers. Today's army has almost 500,000 soldiers, and there are more than 200,000 sailors in the Navy today. To fight a war and have any chance of winning, the president had to find more soldiers pretty quickly. Remember, in 1812, many Americans were farmers. They used guns to hunt and protect their homes. President Madison now asked farmers to use their guns to fight for their country. He offered them money and land if they would join. Did they? Asked Adele. Although some people were against the war, explained Grandfather Lafitte, many men were eager to join. These soldiers didn't always get the best military training, though. That is why in the beginning of the war things did not go so well for us. Our government and military leaders were counting on the fact that the British were busy fighting the French, and that they would not be able to put up much of a fight against us. They hoped that the British would not have a large enough army. In fact, some people expected the British to give up almost immediately. As it turned out, none of these assumptions were right. An assumption is something that is believed to be true, but is not known to be true. Some assumptions turn out to be true, but others do not. The British did not back down. As the weeks and months went on, they came up with a three-part plan to attack us. First, they would launch an attack from British territory in Canada and move their army into New York State. Then they would attack our coastal cities, including Washington, D.C., and Baltimore. Finally, they would try to capture New Orleans and gain control of the Mississippi River. Where did the battles first take place? Asked J.P. We thought our best chance was to attack the British in Canada, continued Grandfather Lafitte. About 3 weeks after the start of the war, an American general led a small army of militiamen into Canada. Militiamen are men who were trained to be soldiers but who were not part of the army. Unfortunately, they were defeated and were forced to surrender to the British. Surrender means to give up, allowing the other side to win. Other defeats in the Great Lakes area resulted in the loss of territory north and west of Ohio to the British. This also meant that settlers in neighboring Indiana were now vulnerable. Vulnerable means exposed to danger or harm. And, as had already been suspected, some Native Americans took up weapons to fight alongside the British. They thought that this might be the only way they could protect their land. Because of this war, Native Americans suffered greatly. Did we fight at sea as well? Asked J.P. I was wondering that too, said Adele. We certainly did. That was where we had some important victories, replied Grandfather Lafitte. You mentioned the USS Constitution on your list. That ship was also known back then as Old Ironsides. In the very beginning of the war, this incredible ship defeated a British ship off the coast of Canada. Both ships fought a hard battle. At one point, the two ships were right next to each other. Cannonballs from the USS Constitution smashed into the sides of the British ship. They caused a lot of damage, and even though the British ship fired back, they did much less damage to our ship. It's said that some of their cannonballs even bounced off the side of the Constitution because its walls were so thick. Is that how it got its nickname? Asked Adele. Yes, thanks to Old Ironsides, the British were forced to surrender. It is probably safe to say that at least in the early stages of the war, we were much more successful at sea than we were on land. Hooray! Cheered J.P. and Adele together. The British were determined to ruin the U.S. trading economy and prevent us from getting supplies we needed. The economy refers to the system in which people buy, sell, or trade items or their services. So they blockaded most of the U.S. coastline. Luckily, we knew our waterways much better than the British did. Waterways are canals and rivers in which boats can travel. We even had privateers who were able to stop many British merchant or trading ships and take their cargo. Privateers are sailors on private ships that are hired to attack and rob other ships. "Oh, is this the part where you tell us about pirates?" asked JP eagerly. "Not quite," chuckled Grandfather Lafitte. Many of the privateers in the War of 1812 were hired by the United States government. However, it's true some of those privateers had previously been pirates. There's one privateer in particular that I'm going to tell you about later, but we haven't quite gotten to that part of the story. "Did the Americans think we would win the War of 1812? asked Adele. "We weren't sure, but we were determined not to give up," explained Grandfather Lafitte. "The next year, we sent our army back into Canada. We took back the town we had lost so that we could protect our territories again. This gave us hope. We had another victory later that year when our Navy defeated an entire fleet of British ships on Lake Erie. A fleet is a group of military ships run by the same leader." "Was that when we knew we would win?" asked JP. "No, we were never completely sure that we could win," replied Grandfather. "You see, by 1814, the end of the Napoleonic Wars was in sight. That meant that the British would have more soldiers and naval ships available to spare. Now that they weren't busy fighting with France, they could turn their full attention toward the war with the United States. Of course, they were still keeping many foreign ships from entering U.S. ports," Grandfather added. "To make matters worse, they knew the United States was almost out of money." "Did the British think we would surrender?" asked JP. "Oh, they probably did," replied Grandfather thoughtfully. "What happened next?" Adele wanted to know. "Before I explain, we need to go down to the barn and take care of the horses." "Okay," exclaimed the children as they jumped up out of their chairs and off the porch. Adele grabbed her grandfather's hand, and the three walked together to the barn. Grandfather still held the mysterious leather journal tightly in his other hand.